At 9,000 feet over the French coast, a B-24 Liberator held together by wire and prayer refused to fall. The right landing gear hung loose, sheared metal glinting in morning light. The co-pilot was dead. The pilot's right foot was nearly severed, attached by a strip of tissue thinner than parachute cord. Blood pooled in his flight boot at a rate that gave him perhaps 20 minutes of consciousness. Behind him, wounded crewmen lay scattered across a fuselage punctured by 47 flak holes. The aircraft was losing altitude at 300 feet per minute. The English Channel stretched ahead, cold and absolute. The mathematics of survival had already failed. The B-24 Liberator was never meant to absorb punishment. It was designed to carry it. Where the B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through redundancy and resilience, the Liberator traded armor for altitude and range. Its high-aspect Davis wing generated exceptional lift, but demanded precise handling. The aircraft could haul 8,000 pounds of ordnance across 1,800 miles, but every engineer who built it understood the compromise. The wing spar ran through the upper fuselage like a spine. Sever it, and the aircraft folded. On this morning, June 5, 1944, that spine held. Barely. The bomber, bearing tail number 4250,000 and something, records vary on the precise serial, had entered German-controlled airspace as part of a massed 8th Air Force strike. The target was coastal fortifications near Wimereux, France. The timing was deliberate. Allied commanders needed the Luftwaffe's eyes fixed anywhere but the English Channel. In fewer than 24 hours, Operation Overlord would begin. Every bomb dropped on the French coast served a purpose beyond destruction: deception, distraction, degradation. The bomber formations had launched from bases across East Anglia, their contrails stitching white seams across the dawn. By the time they reached the French coast, they flew in staggered boxes designed to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. The theory was elegant. German fighters approaching from any angle would face multiple .50 caliber machine guns from multiple aircraft. The reality was messier. Flak over Wimereux was heavy and accurate. German gunners had been tracking American formations for months. They understood the bomber stream's altitude preferences, its approach corridors, its predictable bomb runs. The 80 batteries below had been reinforced specifically because Allied planners expected pre-invasion strikes against coastal defenses. The lead aircraft in the formation had already taken hits before reaching the initial point. One bomber had dropped from formation with a feathered engine, turning back toward England with its crew praying the remaining 3 Pratt & Whitneys held. Another had exploded outright, its bomb load cooking off in a fireball that left no parachutes. The aircraft carrying Lieutenant Colonel Leon Vance pressed on. Vance was not the pilot. He was the mission commander, a distinction that mattered enormously in the hierarchical structure of 8th Air Force operations. As deputy commander of the 489th Bombardment Group, his role was oversight, not direct control. He occupied the co-pilot's seat because command required visibility, and visibility required proximity to the flight deck. The pilot, First Lieutenant Earl Carper, had the yoke. Carper was experienced, steady, and focused on the approach to target. The bombardier, crouched in the nose compartment, was aligning his Norden bomb sight with the fortifications below. The flight engineer monitored fuel flow and engine temperatures. The radio operator sat at his station behind the flight deck, headset pressed to his ears, listening for formation updates. 10 crewmen, 1 aircraft, 47 seconds from the bomb release point. The first flak burst detonated 20 feet below the left wing. The concussion lifted the aircraft, then dropped it. Carper corrected instinctively, maintaining the bomb run. The bombardier held his sight picture. The second burst was closer. Shrapnel raked the fuselage from nose to tail. The No. 3 engine coughed, recovered, then coughed again. Oil pressure began dropping. The third burst killed Earl Carper. The shell fragment entered through the windscreen at an angle that defied probability. It struck the pilot in the chest, killing him instantly. His hands fell from the yoke, his feet slipped off the rudder pedals. The Liberator, suddenly unguided, began a slow yaw to starboard. In the co-pilot's seat, Leon Vance felt the aircraft drift before he understood why. He grabbed the yoke, correcting the heading, and only then saw the blood spreading across Carper's flight suit. The pilot's eyes were open, but empty. The bomb run was not complete. The bombardier was still aligned. 47 seconds had become 32. Vance made the first of several decisions that would define the next hour. He did not abort. He held the aircraft steady, maintaining the heading, the altitude, the airspeed required for accurate bomb release. The flak continued. Another burst opened a hole in the bomb bay doors. Another severed hydraulic lines. The bombardier released. Bombs fell. The aircraft, suddenly lighter by 4,000 pounds, lifted slightly. Vance began a turn toward England. He did not yet know the full extent of the damage. He did not know that his right foot had been shattered by shrapnel during the same burst that killed Carper. Shock and adrenaline had masked the injury. He knew only that the aircraft was sluggish, that the No. 3 engine was failing, that the pilot beside him was dead, and that 9 other men depended on his next decision. The Liberator was losing altitude. The English coast was 93 miles away. The channel water temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The mathematics of survival had already failed, but the aircraft was still flying. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Leon Robert Vance, Jr. was born in Enid, Oklahoma, on August 11, 1916. His father was a career Army officer, and the rhythm of military life shaped his childhood. Relocations, discipline, the quiet understanding that service was not a choice, but an inheritance. He attended the University of Oklahoma before transferring to the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1939. His yearbook entry described a young man of steady temperament, neither flashy nor withdrawn. Classmates remembered him as methodical, someone who prepared thoroughly and executed cleanly. The Army Air Corps was expanding rapidly in 1939, and Vance entered flight training with the detached focus of someone who understood that flying was a craft, not an adventure. He earned his wings and moved through the training pipeline with unremarkable efficiency. No dramatic incidents, no legendary feats. He was competent, professional, and consistent. By 1944, he had accumulated enough experience and rank to serve as deputy commander of the 489th Bombardment Group, stationed at RAF Halesworth in Suffolk, England. The 489th was a B-24 unit, part of the 2nd Air Division of the 8th Air Force. It had been operational for only a few months, but the learning curve for heavy bomber groups was steep and unforgiving. Vance's role was administrative as much as operational. He oversaw training, discipline, mission planning, and the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether young crews lived or died. He flew missions when command required his presence, but his value to the group lay in organization, not individual heroics. Those who served under him described a quiet authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver dramatic speeches. He reviewed after-action reports, identified patterns, and adjusted procedures. When crews returned from difficult missions, he was present, not to congratulate, but to listen, to learn, to improve. This was the man who now sat in a blood-soaked cockpit, wrestling a dying aircraft toward England. His training had prepared him for mechanical failures, for combat damage, for the loss of engines and systems. It had not prepared him for the sensation of flying with a foot that was no longer functional, attached by tissue that would not survive the next hour. But preparation and improvisation are not opposites. They are phases of the same process. Vance knew the Liberator's systems intimately. He understood the relationship between manifold pressure and fuel consumption. He knew how much altitude he could trade for distance. He understood that the No. 3 engine, now trailing smoke, would need to be feathered before it seized and created asymmetric thrust that could spin the aircraft. He made the call. The propeller slowed, then stopped, its blades turned edge-on to the airflow. The Liberator settled onto 3 engines. The flight engineer reported the damage. Hydraulic pressure was gone. The landing gear was compromised. The right main gear had been hit and was hanging partially extended. The flaps were inoperative. The bomb bay doors, damaged, could not fully close, creating drag that further degraded performance. 9 men remained alive. Some were wounded. All were aware that the aircraft was not going to reach England in its current state. The Channel stretched below, gray and cold, indifferent to their calculations. The 489th Bombardment Group had been operational since April 1944. In 2 months, its crews had learned the rhythms of 8th Air Force warfare, the early morning briefings, the long climbs to altitude, the cold hours over hostile territory, the desperate math of fuel and distance and enemy fighters. Vance had flown enough missions to understand what separated survivors from statistics. It was rarely courage. It was discipline, restraint, and the ability to make correct decisions under pressure. The 8th Air Force's standard operating procedures were built on hard lessons. Formation integrity was paramount. Aircraft that strayed from formation became targets. Crews that panicked made errors. Pilots who fixated on single threats lost awareness of others. Vance had reinforced these lessons in briefings and debriefings. He had reviewed gun camera footage and damage reports. He had studied the patterns of German flak concentrations and fighter tactics. He knew that survival over Europe was a function of collective behavior, not individual brilliance. On previous missions, he had observed the careful management of fuel states, the constant monitoring of engine temperatures, the disciplined communication between crew positions. He had seen how experienced crews handled emergencies, calmly, methodically, working through checklists while the sky exploded around them. Now he was applying those lessons alone. The co-pilot's seat was not designed for single-pilot operations. The yoke responded, but the rudder pedals required force that his right leg could no longer provide. Blood had soaked through his flight boot and was pooling on the cockpit floor. The pain, initially masked by shock, was beginning to assert itself. He compensated by using his left leg to maintain directional control, pressing the left rudder pedal while using trim to offset asymmetric forces. It was awkward, exhausting, and barely adequate. The flight engineer moved forward to assist. He took over, throttle management, adjusting power settings on Vance's commands. The remaining crew members redistributed themselves to improve weight and balance. Everyone who could move was doing something useful. This was not heroism. It was procedure, adapted to catastrophe. The aircraft continued west, losing altitude gradually, engines straining against damage and drag. The English coast was still 70 miles away. The fuel state was adequate, barely. But fuel would not matter if the aircraft could not maintain altitude long enough to reach land, Vance calculated. At their current rate of descent, they would reach the water approximately 15 miles from the English coast. A ditching in the Channel was survivable, but only if executed correctly. The B-24 was notoriously difficult to ditch. Its high wing and deep fuselage made water landings unpredictable. Some crews had survived, many had not. He needed another option. 31 miles from the English coast, the number 1 engine began to fail. The warning came from the flight engineer, oil pressure dropping, temperature rising, the telltale vibration of bearings beginning to seize. Vance had seconds to decide. If he feathered the engine immediately, he might preserve the propeller and reduce drag. If he waited, the engine could freeze, its prop windmilling uselessly, adding drag that would accelerate their descent. He gave the order. The number 1 propeller slowed, joined its companion on the number 3 engine, and fell silent. 2 engines, 70 miles of water, a crew of 10. The Liberator could not maintain altitude on 2 engines under optimal conditions. With the damage they had sustained, the open bomb bay doors, the extended landing gear, the accumulated drag of shattered aluminum and severed cables, optimal conditions were a memory. Vance faced a choice that doctrine did not address. The aircraft was going into the water. The only question was whether the crew would be alive when it happened. A controlled ditching was possible, but the damage to the aircraft made success unlikely. The compromised landing gear would catch the water asymmetrically. The weakened fuselage might break apart on impact. The crew, some of them wounded, might not escape a sinking aircraft. There was another option. The crew could bail out over the channel, trusting their Mae Wests and dinghy to keep them alive until rescue arrived. Air-sea rescue units patrolled these waters. If the crew bailed out close to the English coast, their chances of recovery were reasonable. But there was a complication. One crew member, accounts vary on the specific details, but the weight of evidence suggests someone was too badly wounded to bail out safely. Jumping from a moving aircraft required coordination, strength, and timing. A wounded man might not survive the exit. He might strike the tail surfaces. He might be unconscious before his chute opened. Vance made a decision that would define his legacy. He ordered the crew to bail out. He would stay with the aircraft. The logic was brutal and clear. If he remained at the controls, he could maintain altitude and heading long enough for the crew to exit safely. He could position the aircraft for a ditching that might be survivable for himself and anyone too wounded to jump. The crew resisted. Vance was their commander. Leaving him alone in a dying aircraft violated every instinct. But orders were orders, and time was running out. One by one, the able-bodied crew members moved to the exits. One by one, they jumped into the gray air above the channel. Their parachutes blossomed against the overcast sky. The flight engineer was among the last to go. He looked back at Vance, at the blood-soaked cockpit, at the instruments showing 2 engines and decreasing altitude. Then he jumped. Vance was alone, or nearly alone. The wounded crew member remained, unable to exit safely. The Liberator continued west, descending, engines straining, pilot bleeding. What happened next required no training because no training existed for it. Leon Vance was flying a B-24 Liberator with 2 functioning engines, a compromised airframe, inoperative hydraulics, damaged landing gear, and a right foot attached by less than an inch of tissue. He was losing blood at a rate that would soon render him unconscious. A wounded crew member lay somewhere behind him. He could not bail out. Even if he wanted to, his injured leg made a controlled exit impossible. He would stay with the aircraft until it stopped flying. The English coast was now visible, a gray line on the horizon, impossibly distant. The altimeter showed 3,000 feet. The rate of descent was stable but relentless. He would reach the coast at approximately 1,000 feet, possibly less. 1,000 feet was enough to attempt a landing. But where? The damaged landing gear eliminated conventional runways. A gear-up landing on a prepared surface was survivable, but the extended right gear would catch the ground asymmetrically, cartwheeling the aircraft. The flaps were inoperative, which meant approach speeds would be higher than normal. The hydraulics were gone, which meant brakes were gone. Vance's only option was the water. A ditching in the channel, close to shore, offered the best chance of rescue. The sea state was moderate, not calm, but not violent. If he could set the aircraft down nose high, if he could keep the wings level, if the fuselage held together long enough for escape, he and the wounded crew member might survive. He began the approach. The Liberator crossed the coastline at 800 feet, then continued out over the water. Vance needed distance from the shore to execute the ditching safely. Too close, and he risked striking obstacles. Too far, and rescue would be delayed. He picked his spot, a stretch of water that looked no different from any other stretch, but satisfied his exhausted calculation of angle, distance, and probability. The final approach was not graceful. The aircraft was too damaged, the pilot too weakened, the circumstances too far beyond design parameters. But Vance maintained control. He held the nose up as the aircraft descended. He kept the wings level as the water rushed toward him. The Liberator touched down. The impact was violent. The aircraft decelerated abruptly, throwing Vance against his harness. Water exploded through every opening in the fuselage. The nose dipped, then lifted, then settled. The wings remained attached, barely. The Liberator was floating. Sinking, but floating. Vance was still conscious. That itself was remarkable, given the blood he had lost, the trauma he had sustained, the forces of the impact. He released his harness and attempted to move. His right foot, what remained of it, was trapped in the wreckage of the cockpit. The impact had driven metal into already destroyed tissue. He pulled. The foot separated completely. Vance did not record his thoughts in that moment, and no witness was present to describe his reaction. What is known is that he freed himself from the cockpit, made his way through the sinking fuselage, located the wounded crew member, and dragged both of them to an escape hatch. The water was cold. 54 degrees, a temperature that would induce hypothermia within minutes. But Vance had reached a life raft, one of the dinghies that had deployed during the ditching. He helped the wounded crew member into the raft, then climbed in himself. The Liberator sank behind them, disappearing into the gray water. Approximately 47 minutes later, a British air-sea rescue launch reached the raft. They found 2 men alive, one barely conscious from blood loss, missing his right foot, having flown a crippled bomber across 90 miles of hostile airspace on 2 engines with 1 leg. He was still alive. The rescue launch brought Vance and the wounded crew member to shore. Medical personnel were waiting. The extent of Vance's injuries became fully apparent only after he was removed from the raft. The severed foot, the blood loss, the secondary shrapnel wounds that had gone unnoticed in the chaos. He was transported to a military hospital. Surgeons amputated what remained of his right leg below the knee. He survived the surgery. In the days that followed, reports filtered back from the crew members who had bailed out. All had been recovered. All were alive. The parachutes had functioned. The Mae Wests had worked. Air-sea rescue had found them scattered across a stretch of channel water, cold and frightened but intact. The mission itself had achieved its objective. The bombs had hit their targets. The coastal fortifications at Wimereux had been damaged. The larger purpose, drawing German attention away from the invasion beaches, had been served. On June 6, 1944, the day after Vance's mission, Operation Overlord began. The bureaucratic machinery of military recognition began to process the events of June 5th. After-action reports were filed, crew statements were collected. The sequence of decisions, Vance assuming control after Carper's death, completing the bomb run, ordering the crew to bail out, ditching the aircraft, escaping with a wounded crew member, was documented with the dispassionate precision of military records. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through channels. It reached the desks of commanders who understood what the citation described, who could translate the formal language into the reality of blood and metal and impossible choices. On August 5, 1944, the White House announced that Lieutenant Colonel Leon Vance, Jr. would receive the Medal of Honor. The citation, when released, used words like extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. It described his actions in the measured prose of official recognition, stripping away the chaos and terror to present a narrative of duty fulfilled. Vance received the medal while still recovering from his wounds. The ceremony was brief. He did not give speeches. He was scheduled to return to the United States, to rejoin his family, to begin whatever life awaited a one-legged pilot who had been through what he had been through. On July 26, 1944, he boarded a C-54 transport aircraft at Prestwick, Scotland, bound for the United States. The aircraft, carrying wounded servicemen and military personnel, departed into overcast skies. It never arrived. The C-54 disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean. No distress call was received, no wreckage was recovered, no bodies were found. The aircraft and everyone aboard simply vanished. Leon Vance was 37 days away from his 28th birthday. He had survived one of the most harrowing flights in the history of American military aviation. He had not survived the flight home. The official Medal of Honor citation for Lieutenant Colonel Leon Vance, Jr. reads, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty on 5 June 1944, when he led a heavy bombardment group attack against defended enemy coastal positions in the vicinity of Wimereux, France. Approaching the target, his aircraft was hit repeatedly by anti-aircraft fire, which seriously crippled the ship, killed the pilot, and wounded several members of the crew, including Lieutenant Colonel Vance, whose right foot was practically severed. In spite of his injury, and with 3 engines lost to the flak, he continued the run over the target and released the bombs. After the bombardier had made the drop, Lieutenant Colonel Vance, realizing that the damage to his ship made it impossible for the crew to bail out safely over land, elected to crash land in the English Channel. He held his course and ditched the aircraft, managing, despite his nearly severed foot, to extricate himself and the wounded. Crew members from the wreckage and inflate the life raft. They were shortly rescued by an air-sea rescue unit. The citation contains inaccuracies. The aircraft did not lose 3 engines before bomb release. That damage accumulated afterward. The sequence of events was compressed and simplified for formal recognition. This is not unusual. Citations are not historiography. They are summaries, designed to justify an award rather than reconstruct an experience. What the citation cannot capture is the physical reality of flying a 4-engine bomber with 1 functional leg and a dying crew around you. It cannot convey the sensation of blood pooling in a flight boot, the vibration of failing engines, the cold mathematics of altitude and distance. It cannot express the weight of ordering men to jump into empty air while you remain behind, and it cannot explain why the man who did these things never came home. The disappearance of the C-54 transport remains unexplained. Investigations at the time concluded that the aircraft likely suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure or encountered severe weather over the Atlantic. No evidence of enemy action was found, though German long-range aircraft occasionally patrolled those waters. The most probable explanation is the simplest. Something went wrong, and the Atlantic swallowed the evidence. Leon Vance's body was never recovered. His wife, Georgette, and his daughter Sharon received word of his loss weeks after his Medal of Honor had been confirmed. The medal arrived. The man did not. In the years after the war, Vance became one of many names inscribed on memorials and cited in histories. Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma, his hometown, was named in his honor in 1949. Generations of Air Force pilots have trained at the base bearing his name, most knowing only that he was a Medal of Honor recipient, not the details of what earned that recognition. The B-24 Liberator, the aircraft that carried him on his final combat mission, continued flying until the end of the war. The type accumulated a statistical record of loss rates and mechanical difficulties that made it controversial among crews. Some loved it, some feared it. None who flew it forgot the peculiar vulnerability of that high, thin wing. What defines a pilot's legacy is rarely the moment of crisis. It is the accumulation of choices that led to that moment. The training absorbed, the habits formed, the discipline maintained when no one was watching. Leon Vance spent years preparing for a situation he could never have anticipated. When that situation arrived, he responded not with inspiration, but with application. He used what he knew. He adapted what he didn't. He made decisions that doctrine could not provide and physics barely permitted. The German flak batteries that damaged his aircraft that morning were doing their job. The crews who fired those guns could not have known what happened afterward. The decisions made in that cockpit, the men who survived because of them, the pilot who bled quietly while his aircraft refused to fall. In some versions of history, that's called heroism. In others, it's simply called doing the work. Leon Vance did the work. He did not return to explain it. The sky and the sea took him before he could grow old, before he could tell his daughter what those hours felt like, before he could become anything other than a name on a medal and a base in Oklahoma. He was 27 years old. The aircraft should have been gone. It stayed airborne because someone stayed at the controls, and when staying was no longer possible, he made sure others would live to remember why it mattered. The channel water that morning was 54 degrees. It would have killed an ordinary man in minutes. Vance survived long enough to be rescued, long enough to receive his medal, long enough to board a transport that would disappear without a trace. Some arithmetic cannot be solved. Some pilots do the math anyway. The aircraft should be gone, but it wasn't.